Let's finally round out what has become our nearly year-long look at Kinji Fukasaku's Battles series. We've looked at the unofficial precursor, the series proper, and the spiritual sequel to the whole franchise. And while today's subjects wouldn't be the last entries under the name Battles Without Honor and Humanity, they would be the final films to bear the moniker under Fukasaku's direction. Today we're looking at the sequel series, New Battles Without Honor and Humanity.
As viewers of the show have likely guessed already, today's subjects were released by Arrow Video in the US and the UK, meaning that all 10 films are available under their name. As per usual, Arrow's standard level of quality is present in the release of this trilogy, meaning that if you're interested in the films on display today, you can't go wrong with Arrow's set.
Anyway, with all that out of the way, let's look at the sequels to the Battles series that came out a whopping... wait. All 3 of these came out within only 2 years of the initial series? Oh jeez. If you'll recall from our Cops vs. Thugs video, we mentioned that Fukasaku and company had been run ragged by this series, hence them wanting to move away from the brand even if they were using up leftover concepts within Cops vs. Thugs. It's no wonder when you consider that 8 films were put to screen in only 4 years here. What's notable about these films compared to the original 5 is that we can already see that Fukasaku is beginning to distance himself from the franchise.
As we noted in the episode about the main series, Battles was intended to be only 4 films, and their huge success led to the production of the 5th entry, Final Episode. At this point, Fukasaku and company put their collective feet down and said that enough was enough. Toei, the production company, meanwhile, said that they needed more films under the same name. As a sort of compromise, these new films kept the name while being more or less entirely unrelated to the original films. This, however, can lead to some confusion on the viewers' parts.
The crew were not the only component remaining consistent between the 2 iterations of the Battles world. In fact, much of the cast were retained during the move to New Battles, including Bunta Sugawara in the leading role for each film. What's more, many of the bit players make appearances here as well, including Kunie Tanaka, Sony Chiba, and Meiko Kaji.
With so much overlap in terms of cast and crew, as well as theory behind the Jitsuroku Eiga, but the director and actors moving on to new territory in terms of storytelling and theming, the question remains: how does New Battles hold up today, especially compared to its blockbuster predecessor? Well, we'll go over each of the films one at a time, but in the abstract, we can say that they're all pretty solid on their own. It's hard to separate them from the main series, and, given the titling, we're likely not supposed to separate them from their predecessors. This leaves us in an awkward situation where we want to compare them to the original 5 films, but it somehow feels wrong to do so. Like usual, we can't truly speak to whether or not New Battles is good per se, given how subjective this type of thing is. But what we mean to say here is that these 3 films are notable for different reasons than the originals, meaning that if you liked those earlier projects, you owe it to yourself to check these out. They might not be as meaty simply by virtue of their length relative to one another, but New Battles is a strange case study in a director both wanting to distance himself from one of his most successful properties, yet still using said property's success to help promote a new film. Enough beating around the bush though, let's get into what makes New Battles new.
The trilogy of films begins with the aptly titled New Battles Without Honor and Humanity. This name shows us right up front that this isn't your dad's Battles. However, given the close proximity between Final Episode and this film, being that they were released only 6 months apart, in the projects is present than one might be led to believe by that fancy new kanji placed in front of the recognizable kanji. In fact, not only are the players both in front of and behind the camera familiar here, the setting, Hiroshima, the inciting action, Bunta Sugawara's character being released from jail, and even one of the gangs present are shared between the 2. This places New Battles, or at least this first entry, in the same world of the old series.
Honestly, this film is probably the least remarkable of the trilogy in terms of storytelling, given just how much overlap there is. With how different the second and third entries would try to become, New Battles feels almost more like a pit stop along the way to new ideas. The story is barely worth mentioning thanks to the sheer amount of shared ground between Street Mobster, Battles, and this film. However, something else shared with Street Mobster makes for good conversation, that being the visual style utilized in the film.
Of course, the shaky handheld camera work of the entire series, and the entire genre to be honest, is present. What's more notable, however, is the re-emergence of some frankly bizarre visual decisions not seen since Street Mobster. We briefly brought this up in that Shorty episode, but we didn't go very much in depth about these framing choices. In a move that could almost be called experimental or avant-garde, Fukasaku and his cinematographer take their Dutch angles in New Battles to the logical extreme, by which we mean to say that they turn the camera a full 90 degrees in either direction when the going gets tough. Street Mobster was an equally experimental film, given that it saw Fukasaku playing with the boundaries of the Jitsuroku Eiga.
By the time Battles showed up on the scene, Fukasaku and company had a solid vision for the series, meaning they didn't need to practice their craft in new ways. Rather, they simply needed to hone their skills to the finest point possible. Returning to experimental territory with New Battles, it made sense for them to once more take up these boundary-pushing techniques. Essentially, this means that New Battles is a fascinating expansion of the series, even if the new territory it explores deals more in style than substance. Thankfully, for those looking for a deeper experience, the following entry would flip this formula.
Almost a year after the release of New Battles came the second entry into this pretty loosely connected trilogy, The Boss's Head. Given how rapid the release schedule was up to this point, Fukasaku was practically resting on his laurels with this one. However, that was honestly probably for the better, given how different The Boss's Head ended up compared to the previous film. Gone now are the setting, the inciting action, the gangs, all the things that we're familiar with. In fact, even Bunta Sugawara, who of course retains his star status, takes to playing a new type of character here. This time around, he portrays Kuroda, a drunk vagrant with no direct affiliation to the gangs seen in the film.
The Boss's Head is, at best, only tangentially related to the previous films, and that tangent is mostly connected merely by the presence of Yakuza clans warring over land and criminal empires, and the style borrowed from the prior entries. Mostly, The Boss's Head borrows from Street Mobster and New Battles, using these somewhat avant-garde camera angles. More notably, perhaps, is that Kuroda's character shares the most in common with Bunta Sugawara's lead in Street Mobster, an outsider caught up in the ongoing gang war. Thus, we here see Fukasaku returning to the original film in this franchise to explore new territory theme-wise.
In Street Mobster, Sugawara was promised reparations for taking the fall for another Yakuza, only to be tossed aside following his release from prison. In The Boss's Head, however, we see Sugawara's character instead bonded with the Yakuza, in spite of being a civilian. Thus, when problems heat up within the bonded Yakuza's clan, Sugawara is drawn into the fray, leading to some new perspectives on Yakuza conflict. What's more, there are new character dynamics present here, most notably as we explore the plight of a mother grieving for her son lost in a Yakuza conflict. Sure, we've seen women on the outside of the conflicts being drawn in, but this is perhaps the most emotionally engaging of these portrayals up to this point. It's these little emotional touches that make The Boss's Head stand out from the other films in the entirety of the series, making it one of the most unique of the bunch.
In fact, The Boss's Head moves so far away from the other films up to this point that it makes one wonder what's even the point of keeping the Battles title. However, when we consider the overlap still present, chiefly with cast and crew, we can see how The Boss's Head makes for an expansion of the series. Perhaps, in fact, The Boss's Head presents the largest divergence from the previous 7 films. In this way, we could say that this film is the most notable of the sequel trilogy, exemplifying the most new within their titles. Not since Hiroshima Deathmatch has this universe felt so large simply by virtue of these films presenting different places, characters, themes, and even tones. For this reason alone, The Boss's Head is easily the standout film amongst the three. But don't click off the video yet, we've still got one film to discuss with its own set of notable elements.
About 5 months after The Boss's Head hit theaters, the final Battles film to be directed by Kinji Fukasaku saw release. This time around, audiences were treated to the eloquently titled Last Days of the Boss. Here, Fukasaku seems to have returned to Street Mobster once more for inspiration. We're given a new setting, new gangs, the works. But the tone this time around feels closest to Street Mobster, in that it deals largely with political intrigue. Once again, we're dealing with Bunta Sugawara being drawn into the midst of a battle between rival clans. This time, however, we're less interested in the physical violence fought out between the gangs. Instead, we're looking at the how and the why of this violence. In other words, the political nature of these actions.
In fact, Last Days of the Boss is probably more similar to an entirely different film that we covered in 2017 in terms of presentation and its place within its series. We're referring to the final film in the Stray Cat Rock series. The first 4 films were filled to bursting with exploitation violence, 3 of which were headed by Meiko Kaji as a badass who didn't take crap from anyone. The 5th film in the series, meanwhile, dealt almost entirely with the politics of Kaji's gang trying to get one of their members back from the clutches of his father. This father was the head of a corporation who tried to bring his son back from the gang of rapscallions, grooming him to become the next head of his corporation. Save the explosive conclusion, this final Stray Cat Rock film wants nothing more than to show us the politics of why the ending occurs. This means that most of the film's runtime is spent in conversation and tense standoffs between street toughs and corporate suits, rather than outright violence. And to end this lengthy tangent, Last Days of the Boss takes much the same route.
Last Days of the Boss has a bit more violence than this Stray Cat Rock film, but it's never senseless. Rather, the film is filled with political assassinations, Yakuza ruling as acting bosses while their true bosses are out of the picture, and other abstract actions like this. What's notable, though, is that Sugawara's character here actually hates the political aspect of Yakuza life. This is something we see returning from Cops vs. Thugs, with clear disdain for the political collusion between the cops and thugs of the title, meaning that Cops vs. Thugs, released the previous year, showed us what was to come, in a way. The final film in the proper series is easily the oddball of the entire franchise, given the huge tonal shift present between this and its predecessors. It will likely not be as appealing to a general audience as The Boss's Head, given how much talk and how little action there is here by comparison. However, it's a fitting conclusion to Fukasaku's Battles films, showing that 9 or 10 films in, depending on how you look at it, Fukasaku and company still had it going on. As you may have noticed, we've been calling these Fukasaku's Battles films, because while he might have been done with the series following The Last Days of the Boss, the series outlived his influence.
Fukasaku, fed up with the series at this point, once again tried to retire from the Battles franchise. This time, he was successful, leaving behind not only Battles but also the Jitsiroku Eiga by and large. His later Yakuza efforts, including his next 2 films, would incorporate documentary elements, but this was something like the end of an era. For more information on Fukasaku's career at this point, as well as the movements within the Yakuza genre, we recommend you check out our video from last year's Yakuza Week on Doberman Cop, released about a year after Last Days of the Boss, and remarkably different from the Battle series in terms of tone, presentation, and style.
As we've been saying, though, this wasn't the end for Battles. Another film, titled Aftermath of Battles Without Honor and Humanity, was released in 1979. This time around, Fukasaku was nowhere to be seen, as was also the case for the early 2000s iterations of the franchise. Named aptly yet somewhat confusingly, New Battles Without Honor and Humanity and New Battles Without Honor and Humanity / Murder, these films from 2000 and 2003 seemingly marked the end of the franchise. There's been no word as far as we know of further plans from Toei to continue the series, and as of now, we haven't encountered any plans for Western distributors to localize these later 3 titles. Rest assured that if they ever make it this side of the Pacific, we'll be sure to check back in with what the franchise had left to offer.
For the time being, however, we have this loose trilogy to end on. The original New Battles series. This naming thing got a little more complicated than we would have expected. They're a fitting end to the series. While not a high point for battles necessarily, they contain a good bit of experimentation and fresh ideas that kept the series interesting until Fukasaku's departure. For what it's worth, they're definitely worth a watch if you're interested in Yakuza film or collecting everything Fukasaku ever put to celluloid. From us here at Cinema Nippon, we're glad to finally cap off this months-long journey. I think it's about time we put a moratorium on Yakuza film for a little while, though.
Next time we see you, we're going to be going back in time a little bit further to a different kind of undiscovered classic.